Marcus, the Maverick Thompson, stared at his reflection in the gym mirror, admiring the shiny European Wrestling Championship belt draped over his shoulder. At 28 years old, he had finally made it. The young wrestler from Manchester touched the golden plate of the belt, still unable to believe it was real. Just 5 years ago, he had been nothing more than a security guard working night shifts at a local pub. Life hadn't been easy for Marcus growing up. His mother raised him alone in a small apartment above a fish and chips shop in Manchester's busy streets. She worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, but there was never enough money for luxuries. Marcus found his escape in wrestling videos. He would spend hours watching old matches on a small TV in their kitchen, copying the moves using his bed pillows as practice dummies. At school, Marcus wasn't the brightest student, but he was strong. The other kids called him Big Mark because he was always taller and more muscular than his classmates. While others played football during breaks, Marcus would practice his wrestling moves. Sometimes he got into trouble for being too rough, but he couldn't help it. Wrestling was in his blood. When he turned 18, Marcus started training at a small wrestling club in the basement of an old church. The place smelled like sweat and rubber mats, but to him, it was heaven. His trainer, old Jack, saw something special in the young man. "You got fire in your eyes, boy," old Jack would say, "but you need to learn to control it." Marcus worked hard. During the day, he worked security at the pub, and at night, he trained until his muscles burned. His first matches were in small shows at community centers, where he earned just enough money to buy a burger on his way home. But he didn't care about the money, he cared about the cheers. Every time he stepped into the ring, the crowd's energy made him feel alive. His big break came when a famous wrestler got injured before a show in Liverpool. The promoter needed someone to fill in, and old Jack recommended Marcus. That night, the Maverick was born. Marcus created a character that was wild and unpredictable, someone who didn't play by the rules. The crowd loved it. His signature move, the Maverick Punch, a spinning backhand strike, became famous in local wrestling circles. Soon, Marcus was wrestling in bigger shows. He traveled across England, then to Scotland, Wales, and even some shows in Ireland. His mother couldn't believe it when she saw his picture on wrestling posters. She still kept his first poster hung up in their old apartment, right next to her favorite family photos. The European Wrestling Championship was the biggest event of his career. Nobody expected Marcus to win. He was the underdog, the wild card. But that night, in front of 10,000 screaming fans in London's biggest arena, Marcus did the impossible. He defeated the champion, a Russian wrestler who had held the title for 3 years. The moment the referee counted to 3, Marcus's whole world changed. Now, just 2 weeks after his big win, Marcus was living a different life. People recognized him on the streets. Young wrestlers asked for his advice. He had money in his bank account for the first time in his life. He bought his mother a new TV, much bigger than the old one they used to watch wrestling on. But success changed Marcus in other ways too. He started believing his own hype. The humble boy from Manchester was disappearing, replaced by someone who thought he was untouchable. He stopped listening to old Jack's advice about controlling his temper. The fire in his eyes that his trainer once praised was turning into something dangerous. As Marcus adjusted his championship belt one last time in the mirror, he didn't realize that his greatest challenge wasn't in the wrestling ring. His real fight was with himself, and it was a fight he was slowly losing. In just a few hours, his whole world would come crashing down, and not even his famous Maverick Punch could save him from what was coming. The September morning air felt crisp against Marcus's face as he jogged through London's busy streets. He wore his famous black and gold wrestling jacket with the Maverick written in bold letters across the back. The jacket was too warm for running, but Marcus loved how people stared at him when he wore it. Just 3 weeks after winning the championship, he couldn't get enough of the attention. Marcus had never been to this part of London before. The fancy shops and clean streets were different from his usual neighborhoods. He checked his expensive new smartwatch, 10:15 a.m. His manager had scheduled a photo shoot near Buckingham Palace at noon, but Marcus wanted to explore the area first. Back home in Manchester, he used to watch the changing of the royal guards on TV with his mother. Now he could see it in person. As he jogged past expensive cafes, Marcus noticed people pointing at him and whispering. A group of teenagers were showing each other something on their phones, probably videos of his championship match. The old Marcus would have felt shy about all this attention, but the new European champion loved it. He started running with more style, showing off his athletic movement like he did in the ring. Near Buckingham Palace, the crowds grew bigger. Tourists from all over the world stood behind barriers, waiting for the famous guard-changing ceremony to begin. Marcus slowed down to catch his breath. His watch showed he had burned 500 calories. Not bad for a morning run, he thought, wiping sweat from his forehead with his jacket sleeve. A young boy wearing a wrestling t-shirt spotted him first. "Mom, Mom, it's the Maverick," the boy shouted, pointing at Marcus. Soon, more people started recognizing him. Marcus heard his name being called from different directions. This was exactly what he loved, being the center of attention. "Can we take a selfie?" asked a teenage girl with braces. Her friends stood behind her, giggling and holding their phones. Marcus gave them his best wrestling smile, the one he practiced in the mirror. "Of course. Love. The Maverick always has time for his fans," he said loudly, making sure everyone around could hear him. More people gathered around. Someone asked him to sign their tourist map. Another person wanted to record a video message for their brother. Marcus loved every second of it. He flexed his muscles and posed for photos. The crowd grew bigger, and people started pushing to get closer to him. A street vendor selling ice cream watched the scene with concern. He had worked near Buckingham Palace for 20 years and knew that crowds could be dangerous here. The royal guards were very strict about keeping order. But Marcus didn't notice the vendor's worried looks. He was too busy being a star. "Show us the Maverick punch," someone shouted from the crowd. Others joined in, chanting "Maverick, Maverick, Maverick." Marcus's heart started beating faster. This was just like being in the wrestling ring. He could feel the energy of the crowd, the excitement in their voices. The crowd had pushed him closer to the ceremonial grounds without him realizing it. The black metal barriers that kept tourists away from the guards' marching area were right behind him now. But Marcus didn't care. When he was performing, nothing else mattered. "You want to see the Maverick punch?" he shouted to the crowd. They cheered even louder. Marcus took off his jacket and threw it to a fan, showing off his muscular arms in his tight black tank top. Security cameras turned to focus on the growing crowd, but Marcus didn't notice them. He also didn't notice the two royal guards watching him carefully from their posts. As he prepared to demonstrate his famous move, Marcus was completely unaware that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. In just a few minutes, his morning run would turn into a nightmare that would change everything. The rising star of European wrestling was about to fall, and he was going to fall hard. Marcus stood with his back just inches from the ceremonial grounds, feeling the metal barrier press against his legs. The crowd of tourists had grown to nearly 100 people, all holding their phones up to record him. Their excitement made his blood pump faster, just like it did in the wrestling ring. This was his moment to shine. "The Maverick punch isn't just any move," Marcus announced to his audience, raising his voice like he did during wrestling promos. "It's the most dangerous move in European wrestling." The crowd cheered, and someone started a new chant of "Show us, show us." Behind him, Private James Wells, a 23-year-old royal guard, had already radioed for backup. This was only his third month on duty at Buckingham Palace, but he knew the protocol. Any disruption near the ceremonial grounds needed to be handled quickly and professionally. James stood perfectly still in his red uniform and tall bearskin hat, watching as Marcus backed up even further into the restricted area. Marcus began his demonstration, explaining each part of his signature move. "First, you trick your opponent like this," he said, doing a fake step forward. "Then you spin around." He turned his body, getting closer to where Private Wells stood. The young guard took 3 measured steps forward, exactly as his training required. "Sir," Private Wells said firmly, "you need to return to the public area immediately." His voice was clear and professional, but Marcus didn't seem to hear him. The wrestler was too caught up in his performance, the cheers of the crowd drowning out everything else. And then, Marcus continued, spinning around for the final part of his move. As he turned, his elbow brushed against Private Wells' uniform. The contact surprised Marcus, making him spin faster than he intended. The crowd gasped, some in excitement, others in horror, as they realized how close he was to the royal guard. Time seemed to slow down in that moment. Marcus, startled by the guard's presence and running on pure adrenaline, did something that would haunt him forever. Instead of stopping his demonstration, he let his momentum carry through. His fist, which had knocked out countless wrestlers in the ring, continued its arc through the air. Private Wells saw the punch coming but didn't break his professional stance. His training had taught him to stay composed in any situation. The crowd's excited cheers turned to screams of shock as Marcus's fist connected with the young guard's jaw. The sound of the impact echoed across the ceremonial grounds. The guard's tall bearskin hat fell to the ground as he stumbled backward. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, but he didn't fall. Years of military training kept him on his feet, even as his jaw throbbed with intense pain. The entire crowd fell silent, the only sound being the clatter of dropped phones and shocked gasps. Marcus froze, his fist still extended in the air. The reality of what he had just done hit him like a bucket of cold water. This wasn't a wrestling ring. This wasn't a staged fight. He had just struck a royal guard at Buckingham Palace, one of the most protected places in England. I didn't mean to," Marcus stuttered, but before he could finish his sentence, the area erupted into chaos. Armed police officers seemed to appear from nowhere, their weapons drawn. Tourists scrambled backward, still recording everything on their phones. Some were already uploading the videos to social media, where they would soon go viral. Marcus raised his hands in surrender, his face pale with fear. He could see Private Wells being attended to by other guards, the young man's jaw visibly swollen. In the distance, police sirens wailed, getting closer by the second. Camera phones continued to flash as more tourists arrived, drawn by the commotion. "Get on your knees. Hands behind your head," an armed officer shouted. Marcus obeyed, his legs shaking as he knelt on the ground. As handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in a nearby window. The face looking back at him wasn't the European wrestling champion anymore. It was the face of a man who had just destroyed his entire life in less than 5 seconds. The police van raced through London streets with its sirens blaring. In the back, Marcus sat with his head down, his wrists still in handcuffs. His expensive running shoes, now scuffed from being dragged across the pavement, seemed to mock him. Just 30 minutes ago, he had been a celebrity taking photos with fans. Now he was a criminal being rushed to a high-security police station. Inside Buckingham Palace's medical room, Private James Wells sat on an examination table as a doctor checked his jaw. The young guard's face had swollen to twice its normal size, and every movement sent sharp pain through his head. Yet he remained straight-backed and professional, answering the doctor's questions with short nods or hand signals, since speaking was too painful. The X-rays show a dislocated jaw and a mild concussion, the doctor explained to Wells' commanding officer. He's lucky the punch didn't break his jaw completely. The commander nodded grimly, watching as his youngest guard got ice packs strapped to his face. Despite his injuries, Private Wells had maintained his post for almost 2 minutes after being struck, only stepping down when directly ordered to seek medical attention. Meanwhile, the incident was spreading across the internet like wildfire. Videos taken from different angles showed Marcus's punch in crystal clear detail. News websites were already running headlines. Wrestling champion attacks Royal Guard. Social media exploded with millions of shares and comments. Marcus's phone, confiscated by the police, wouldn't stop buzzing with calls from his manager, his mother, and news outlets from around the world. At the high-security police station, Marcus was led to an interrogation room. The room had gray walls and a single metal table bolted to the floor. 2 stern-faced detectives sat across from him, their expressions showing no sympathy for the former champion. On the table between them lay Marcus's championship belt, which had been in his gym bag during the incident. It didn't look so impressive under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Do you understand the seriousness of what you've done?" the older detective asked, his voice cold. Assaulting a royal guard is considered an attack on the crown itself. Marcus tried to explain that it was all a misunderstanding, that he got carried away with his performance, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. In another room, police officers were reviewing security footage from multiple angles. The palace's high-definition cameras had captured every detail of the incident in perfect clarity. They'd also had over 50 videos from tourists' phones, all showing the same thing: a celebrity wrestler deliberately punching a royal guard in full uniform. Back at Buckingham Palace, journalists had gathered outside the gates. News vans with satellite dishes lined the streets, and reporters did live broadcasts for channels around the world. Private Wells' commanding officer gave a short statement. This attack on one of our guards will be dealt with swiftly and severely. The Royal Guard has protected the Crown for centuries, and any assault on our personnel is treated with the utmost seriousness." Marcus's mother watched the news coverage from her small apartment in Manchester, tears running down her face. The TV showed her son being led into the police station, his head covered with a jacket to hide from cameras. On her wall hung his first wrestling poster, now a painful reminder of how far he had fallen. Inside the police station's holding cell, Marcus sat alone on a hard bench. His wrestling jacket, which had made him feel so special just hours ago, had been taken away as evidence. He wore a plain gray jumpsuit now, the kind given to all prisoners. Through a small window, he could see the sky turning dark with rain clouds. A young police officer appeared at his cell door. "The prosecutor is ready to see you," he said, unlocking the door. "And your lawyer has arrived." Marcus stood up slowly, his legs feeling weak. As he walked down the corridor, he could hear phones ringing constantly at the front desk. The whole world wanted to know about the wrestler who dared to punch a royal guard. Soon, they would all learn about his punishment, and Marcus had a terrible feeling that his wrestling career wasn't the only thing he was about to lose. The emergency courtroom in Westminster looked nothing like the courtrooms Marcus had seen on TV. It was smaller, darker, and much more serious. The wood-paneled walls seemed to close in around him as he sat next to his lawyer, Mr. Thompson, who had been hired by his wrestling management company just 40 minutes ago. The lawyer's expensive suit and worried expression didn't inspire much confidence. "This is unprecedented," Mr. Thompson whispered to Marcus. "They've fast-tracked your case through the system. Usually, it takes weeks or months to get to court." Marcus nodded silently, his eyes fixed on the royal coat of arms hanging above the judge's empty chair. His wrestling championship belt felt like it happened in another lifetime, though it had been just a few hours ago. The courtroom was closed to the public, but 5 journalists had been allowed inside to report on the proceedings. Their pencils were poised over notepads, ready to record every detail of the famous wrestler's downfall. 2 armed guards stood by the door, their faces as stern as the ones at Buckingham Palace. At exactly 11:15 a.m., less than an hour after the incident, Judge Margaret Blackwood entered the courtroom. She was a small woman with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to look right through Marcus. Everyone stood as she took her seat, her black robes rustling in the silence. The prosecutor, a tall man named Mr. Richards, spoke first. He had 3 screens set up, showing different angles of the incident. "Your Honor," he began, "the evidence in this case is irrefutable. We have high-definition footage from palace security cameras, over 50 tourist videos, and dozens of eyewitnesses." He played the videos one by one, each showing Marcus's punch in perfect detail. Marcus watched himself on the screens, unable to believe how quickly everything had happened. In the videos, he looked like a different person, arrogant, careless, dangerous. The sound of his fist hitting Private Wells' jaw echoed through the courtroom speakers, making several people wince. Mr. Thompson tried his best to defend Marcus. "Your Honor, my client is a performer. He got carried away with his entertainment act. There was no malicious intent." But even as he spoke, the lawyer's voice lacked conviction. The videos showed Marcus clearly ignoring warnings and crossing barriers before throwing the punch. The prosecutor then showed medical reports from the palace doctor. "Private Wells has suffered a dislocated jaw, a severe concussion, and possible nerve damage," Mr. Richards stated. "A trained fighter like Mr. Thompson would know the damage his punch could cause. This was no accident." Judge Blackwood listened to both sides, her expression growing sterner by the minute. When Private Wells' commanding officer testified about the guard's exemplary service record and the importance of protecting royal institutions, Marcus felt his last hopes fading away. Furthermore, the prosecutor continued, "This attack has already been viewed by millions worldwide. It strikes at the heart of our nation's most sacred institutions. The Royal Guard has protected our monarchy for centuries. Any attack on them must be treated with the utmost severity." Marcus's lawyer made one last attempt. He talked about Marcus's clean record, his rise from poverty, how he had inspired young people through wrestling. He even mentioned Marcus's mother, who was watching her only son's future crumble on live TV. But the videos playing silently on the screens behind him told a different story. Judge Blackwood removed her glasses and looked directly at Marcus. The courtroom fell completely silent. Even the journalists stopped writing, their pens frozen above their notepads. Marcus could feel sweat running down his back as he waited for her to speak. "Rise," she commanded, her voice firm and clear. Marcus stood on shaky legs, his handcuffs clicking softly. Through the courtroom's small window, he could see the same gray clouds that had been gathering all morning. In just a few seconds, he would learn his fate, and deep in his heart, he already knew it wouldn't be good. The judge's next words would turn his life upside down, transforming him from a celebrity wrestler to something very different. As she prepared to speak, Marcus closed his eyes, thinking of his mother watching at home, and all the fans who had believed in him. The sentence she was about to give would change everything. Judge Blackwood's voice cut through the silent courtroom like a knife. "Marcus Thompson," she began, gripping her gavel tightly, "your actions today have demonstrated a complete disregard for one of our nation's most sacred institutions." She paused, looking down at the former wrestling champion who now seemed so small in his gray prison jumpsuit. The clock on the courtroom wall showed 11:42 a.m. It had been exactly 57 minutes since Marcus had thrown that fatal punch at Buckingham Palace. Outside, news helicopters circled the building, their distant chopping sound seeping through the thick windows. Every TV channel in Britain had interrupted their regular programs to await the verdict. "The evidence presented leaves no room for doubt," Judge Blackwood continued. "The attack was clearly captured on multiple cameras. The victim, Private James Wells, suffered serious injuries while performing his sworn duty to the Crown." She lifted a paper from her desk, adjusting her glasses to read from it. Marcus stood perfectly still, his legs feeling like lead. Behind him, one of the journalists accidentally dropped his pen, the small sound making everyone jump. Mr. Thompson, his lawyer, placed a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder, but they both knew what was coming. "This court takes into consideration your previous good character," the judge said, her tone softening slightly. "Your rise from difficult circumstances to sporting success is commendable. However," she paused again, her expression hardening, "your status as a professional athlete makes this attack even more serious. You are trained to fight, Mr. Thompson. You, more than most, should understand the consequences of violence." In the front row of the small gallery, a police officer who had arrested Marcus was taking notes. Next to him sat Private Wells' commanding officer, his red uniform standing out against the dark wood of the courtroom. Both men watched intently as Judge Blackwood prepared to deliver the sentence. "The law is clear on attacks against royal guards," she declared. "Parliament has set strict guidelines to protect those who protect our monarchy. Your celebrity status does not place you above these laws. In fact, it places a greater responsibility upon you as a public figure." Marcus felt his heart pounding in his chest. Through the courtroom's window, he could see camera flashes from the media gathered outside. Somewhere out there, his mother would be watching this on TV, probably still wearing the Maverick t-shirt he had given her after winning the championship. Taking into account the severity of the offense, the injuries sustained by Private Wells, and the need to send a clear message to the public, Judge Blackwood continued, her voice growing firmer, "This court sentences you to 10 years in prison without the possibility of early release." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. 10 years. He would be 38 when he got out. His wrestling career would be long over. The journalists' pencils scratched frantically against their notepads as they recorded the historic sentence. "Furthermore," the judge added, "you are permanently banned from entering any royal or government property after your release. You will pay compensation to Private Wells in the amount of £50,000. Your wrestling license will be suspended indefinitely." Mr. Thompson immediately stood up to appeal the sentence, but Judge Blackwood raised her hand to silence him. "The severity of this sentence reflects not just your actions, Mr. Thompson, but their location and target. An attack on a royal guard is an attack on the very foundation of our security services." She lifted her gavel, the sound of it striking the wooden block echoing through the courtroom like a thunderclap. "Court is adjourned." As soon as she said these words, 2 prison officers stepped forward to escort Marcus away. Before leaving the courtroom, Marcus took one last look at his championship belt, still sitting on the evidence table. The gold plates no longer shined under the fluorescent lights. In just 1 hour, he had gone from being European wrestling champion to inmate number 24,601 at Her Majesty's prison service. As the heavy doors closed behind him, Marcus heard the journalists rushing out to break the news to the world. His story would be a warning to others, a cautionary tale about how fame, arrogance, and one moment of madness could destroy a lifetime of achievement. 1 month after the sentence, Private James Wells stood at his post outside Buckingham Palace, his jaw fully healed, but his memory still fresh. Tourists often pointed at him now, whispering about how he was that guard from the viral video. Some even tried to take selfies with him, but Wells maintained his professional stance, staring straight ahead just as his training required. Inside his cell at Belmarsh Prison, Marcus Thompson sat on his narrow bed, staring at the blank wall. His once muscular frame had already started to shrink without access to his regular gym routine. The other inmates knew who he was, some had even been fans, but they kept their distance. Even in prison, attacking a royal guard made you an outsider. The small TV in the prison common room often showed reruns of his wrestling matches. During these times, Marcus would stay in his cell, unable to watch his past glory. His championship belt had been put in a museum display about the history of the Royal Guard, alongside the security footage of his attack. The exhibition was called Protecting the Crown, Centuries of Service and Sacrifice. Back in Manchester, Marcus's mother had moved out of their old apartment. The constant visits from journalists and wrestling fans had become too much. She now lived with her sister in a quiet village, where nobody knew her as the mother of the wrestler who attacked a royal guard. Every Sunday she made the long journey to visit Marcus in prison, reading photos from home and trying not to cry when she saw him in his prison uniform. Private Wells received a special commendation for his conduct during the incident. His commanding officer praised how he had maintained his post despite his injuries, upholding centuries of Royal Guard tradition. The young guard's story was now part of the training program for new recruits, teaching them about dedication and professionalism in the face of danger. The European Wrestling Championship created new rules after the incident. All wrestlers had to sign contracts promising not to perform moves in public spaces. They called it the Maverick Rule, though nobody used Marcus's old wrestling name anymore. His championship title had been vacated, his records erased from the books as if he had never existed. 6 weeks after the sentencing, the first documentary about the incident aired on national television. It was called 57 Minutes, The Fall of the Maverick. The program showed interviews with legal experts, royal historians, and even Marcus's old trainer, Old Jack, who cried on camera as he talked about the talented boy he had once trained. "He was a good lad," Old Jack said in the documentary, wiping his eyes. But fame changed him, made him forget where he came from, made him think he was untouchable. The documentary became the most watched program of the year, translated into 12 languages for audiences worldwide. In his cell, Marcus kept a small calendar where he marked off the days. 9 years and 11 months to go. He spent his time writing letters to his mother, to Old Jack, and even one to Private Wells, apologizing for what he had done. Wells never responded, but the palace issued a short statement acknowledging the apology. The small wrestling club where Marcus had started his career closed down 3 months after his sentencing. Nobody wanted to train there anymore. Parents were afraid their children might follow in the Maverick's footsteps. Old Jack retired, saying his heart wasn't in it anymore after watching his best student throw everything away. Tourism at Buckingham Palace actually increased after the incident. Tour guides added the story to their presentations, pointing out the exact spot where it happened. They'd always ended the tale with a warning about respecting British traditions and institutions. Some tourists even recreated the scene for photos, though palace security quickly stopped this practice. As his first Christmas in prison approached, Marcus received hundreds of letters from former fans. Some expressed disappointment, others offered forgiveness, but most just wanted to understand why he did it. Marcus read each letter but couldn't find the words to respond. How could he explain something he didn't understand himself? In the end, Marcus Thompson's story became more famous than his wrestling career ever was. It was taught in law schools, discussed in Parliament, and used as a warning about the dangers of letting fame go to your head. His entire life had been defined by 57 minutes, the time between throwing a punch and receiving a sentence that changed everything forever.